Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rush Robinson. Today we're going to be discussing Dr. John Dewey. He was an American philosopher and educational psychologist. Did a couple of few things in both fields. So super exciting here. We'll hop right in. Here we go. Dr. Dewey was born on October 20th of 1859, lived 92 years, and died on June 1st of 1952. He was born in Vermont, Burlington, Vermont, which is a small town, not huge by any means. He was one of 4 children to 2 parents who grew up on pretty modest means. They didn't grow up super wealthy or affluent, but cool nonetheless. So starting off with his education here, he was from first went to the University of Vermont, where he was in a couple of different honors fraternities, graduated in 1879, and in between there, before graduate school, he taught a little bit, taught at an elementary school, taught at a high school, didn't really care for it too much, but had a passion for education. And so he went to Johns Hopkins University, got a PhD there, actually worked with 2 pretty notorious psychologists, Herbert Baxter Adams and G. Stanley Hall, who we'll speak on in just a second as well. Kind of moving towards in his career, he started working full-time at University of Michigan. He did this for the next 6 years, from 1888 to 1894, where he completed a dissertation on Immanuel Kant, another famous philosopher. So he's kind of starting to dip his feet in kind of both fields here. He then started working at the relatively new Department of Psychology in the University of Michigan with the help of George Sylvester Morris. A couple years later, he helped start the education department, which had sub-departments in psychology and pedagogy, which is like kind of that education, right? So 2 years later, this led him to founding an educational elementary school that would serve as a laboratory for the university's psychology and education department to kind of, do some different testing, but in that school environment, right? So during this time, Dewey wrote 4 essays collectively published with some other colleagues, and his first major work on education, The School and Society, was published in 1899. Also in 1899, he was elected as the president of the American Psychological Association, or the APA. And then a couple of years after that, he got in a disagreement with some administration at the university, and in 1904, he left the University of Chicago. Then, moved in 1904, moved to Columbia University, and served out the rest of his career until about 1930 at Columbia University. He took a trip to Japan, and in that time ended up getting an invite to Peking University to visit China. This was in 1919. He really enjoyed his time there. His students, the people that come to these speeches and listen to him while he was staying in China, they loved him for his the way he spoke about democracy, which is something that in that part of the world was very different than it was in the Western world. So they were pretty fond of listening to what he had to say about democracy, jurisprudence, science. The government in China was not a fan of him, obviously, though, kind of speaking on those more progressive ideas. In 1934, he went on an invitation to the World Conference of New Education Fellowship. This was in Africa. There he delivered several talks, and later in the year visited various other places around Africa to give more of those speeches. So moving on to some more of his contributions here, I should say. I mentioned The School and the Society earlier, published in 1899. He over the course of his career, published over 700 articles in 140 different journals, approximately 40 of those being those major works. Kind of moving on to his ideas that he displayed and kind of spoke on in his different works. This idea of functional psychology, or kind of functionalism, this thought. One of his major things was with his major work speaking on this, was the reflex arc concept in psychology, published in 1896. He argues that the traditional stimulus response, understanding the reflexive arc, he argues against this. Instead, Dewey believes kind of in this circular account, which serves as stimulus, which is not really a response and then stimulus that is kind of automatic and a reflex is in nature, but more so is circular. And then it is a stimulus, and then it's on the person to kind of behave, and how the situation, the nature of the stimulus, and kind of how that goes from there. He doesn't deny in any way the existence of this kind of stimulus or response. He just disagreed and said that they were separate events happening like links in a chain. He developed this idea that there is a coordination by which a stimulus is enriched by the results of the previous experience. The response is modulated by that sensory experience. Kind of again this kind of functionalism and pragmatist areas of thought. Dewey believed that the human consciousness was shaped by interactions with this environment, and that knowledge is grounded in real life experience. So not so much from a book, but more so from like conversations you would have with someone on the side of the street there. On this pragmatism idea, Dewey was an important figure in this movement, and he argued that language is more powerful to problem solve and figure things out than to describe things and display emotion, which is this kind of pragmatic view. Moving on to his kind of educational philosophy, he applied this area of pragmatism, what he called the pragmatic approach. He thought of the purpose of education was a cultivation of thought and kind of critically reflective, engaged individuals. It was not this passive listening where students just listen to a lecture, but he did reject the idea of like this predetermined curriculum. He didn't like that it was concrete for every student. It wasn't, however, it was not child-centered, right? So this makes you think, okay, well maybe he's going to he's going to a kid and he's like, what? Maybe this kid's really good at guitar. This child-centered approach would say, okay, well we're gonna make this kid, this kid's only gonna do guitar. Dewey was not a fan of this. It was kind of this progressive education in that it was a bit of both, right? It was a combination of this traditional standardized material with techniques that do acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of those students. Lastly here, we have that with that experiential learning. So Dewey wrote about how children learn better when they're actively engaged. He described how educators can use techniques to keep these students engaged and extension create a better environment for these students to learn. So maybe doing group activities. In that, all these experiences will be better than any written knowledge, any knowledge that you read out of a book will ever be. Dewey was a big fan of in-class discussion and group interaction, and he believed that socialization is essential for the learning process. Moving on, here we go, a little quote here. Education is not preparation for life, it's actually life itself, and that was from John Dewey, of course. Moving on to the zeitgeist of the time. When John Dewey did his different education and obviously the rest of his career. This was a very formative time for field of psychology. So these famous psychologists, John B. Watson, Sigmund Freud, they had these different ideas. It marked a pivotal time from where psychology was taken from philosophy and this kind of humanities-esque thing to something that was more scientific, right? So something that can be compared more to physics or biology than to political science, right? So behaviorism was this kind of what the focus shifted to, where it was more on observable behavior and conditioning rather than this psychoanalysis, the Sigmund Freud type of this unconscious that is kind of hard to reach, right? Another big thing during this time was this idea of democracy and really engaging in not only politics, but also just like how you would talk to people. It was about just engaging with each other. So Dewey believed that the democracy expanded political systems to encompass a way of life that encouraged participation. Dewey thought of democracy as more than just voting rights. It was an encompassing idea that people should be encouraged to speak out and have political discussion, big public discussion. I think this is interesting because what we see now, I think, is Dewey's viewed but played out over 100 years, obviously. In modern times, I think this view has been, it's played out, right? So the biggest thing about democracy now is that people have the illusion of choice. I think this is really speaking on myself. I should relax. But I think to have someone have the free speech and just like let them say whatever they want, almost in this kind of Socratic, democratic way, it almost makes it a bit hidden and everything feels a bit fake now. I think there's like an information crisis almost going on at the moment. Back on topic here though, sorry. Talking about key figures of the time, William James, known as the father of psychology, coined a lot of these famous terms, a lot of different these practical applications that we still use today in contemporary methods. Edward Titchener kind of coined this term of structuralism. It was led by him, and it aimed to identify the basic elements of consciousness through that kind of introspective, what's happening, this kind of Carl Jungian kind of this dream analysis almost, but not really, right? That's kind of on the edges there. John B. Watson In the 1920s, kind of led this behaviorism movement. It gained a lot of traction, and it advocated for the study of only observable behaviors, and kind of rejected this idea of introspection. So a little bit of a double-sided here, Edward Titchener and John B. Watson, but both are very infamous of the time. And then right here, this picture is the world's first psychological laboratory. This was in 1879. William Wundt, I think that's how you say that, founded the Institute for Experimental Psychology, and this was at the University of Leipzig. So super cool, really old picture. And then lastly here we got some references. So obviously a lot of John Dewey's works, and then a couple of there that are more modern, more speaking on his collective works. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and go Tops, I guess.